Dig Two Graves. Part 1. A Shoeshine Timeless Tales creation. Our videos are for entertainment purposes only. Any similarity to real-life people or situations is strictly coincidental. The Florida sun, a molten orange orb, dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the weathered boardwalk of St. Pete Beach. Richard Hardcase Head took a deep drag of his cigarette, the smoke curling up like a phantom in the humid air. 7 years had passed since Emily, his wife, had breathed her last, and the salty tang of the ocean still carried echoes of her laughter. It wasn't the same ocean she'd loved, the one that lapped against the shores of Maine, but it was theirs now, a shared memory clinging to the tide. He shifted the weight of his worn leather jacket, its scuffs and nicks like battle scars from a life lived in the shadows. The nickname Hardcase had stuck during his days in Black Ops, a moniker earned through grit, resilience, and the silent ghosts he carried within. But those days were behind him, buried under Florida sand. Now, his refuge was the humdrum routine of beachfront life, the predictable comfort of the cafe, and the camaraderie of the Thursday night Harley Davidson runs with his newfound friend Mac. The aroma of coffee and sizzling chorizo beckoned him towards the cafe, his haven on bustling Beach Drive. Carmelo, his portly chef with a smile as wide as the Gulf of Mexico, greeted him with a booming, "Welcome back, Hardcase, your usual Americano?" Richard nodded, collapsing onto a stool, worn smooth by countless elbows and whispered stories. Sabrina, the cafe's unofficial manager, a whirlwind of dark hair and sharper wit, snorted from the counter. "Rough day, Hardcase. You look like you swallowed a seagull." Richard chuckled, the sound rough and rarely used. "Just another day in paradise, Sassmaster." The banter was familiar, a symphony of daily routines that masked the deeper currents beneath. Richard knew the regulars, the retired couples, the college kids glued to their laptops, the lone cop nursing his third coffee, each a story waiting to be unraveled. He was just another thread in the tapestry, his past woven into the fabric of the cafe, the silence speaking volumes. A flash of blonde caught his eye. Jordan, the waitress, was flitting between tables, her smile a fleeting ray of sunshine in the dimmed light. He'd noticed her before, drawn to the strength that lurked beneath her beauty, a vulnerability masked by a cool facade. Like him, she carried scars, hers etched by life's harsh dealings, raising 2 daughters alone in a city that wasn't always kind. As their eyes met, a flicker of something passed between them, a shared understanding in the unspoken language of resilience. It was a whisper in the wind, a fleeting connection in the ocean of humanity, but it stirred something within him, a flicker of warmth in the cold ashes of his past. The cafe lights blurred as Richard took another sip of his Americano. The routine was comforting, the familiarity a balm on his soul. But tonight, something felt different. A tremor beneath the surface, a whisper of change carried on the salty breeze. The shadows stretched longer, darker, hinting at secrets lurking just beyond the cafe's warm glow. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but Richard knew one thing. The Hardcase buried beneath the years of quiet routine might not be enough anymore. The ghosts of his past had a way of resurfacing, and the echoes of his Black Ops days were starting to whisper in the wind. The ocean breeze held a new tang, not just of salt, but of something darker, something more sinister. The clock on the wall ticked past 6, the time for the Thursday night run. Richard reached for his jacket, a silent promise hanging heavy in the air. The cafe, his haven, was about to become the launching pad for a journey he wasn't sure he was ready for. But with each drag of his cigarette, with each beat of his hardened heart, Richard, Hardcase Head, knew he had no choice. The shadows were calling, and he had a score to settle with the ghosts of his past and the darkness that threatened to engulf the city he now called home. A promise whispered in the wind, a chapter in the life of a man who wasn't quite ready to hang up his guns. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, a foreshadowing of the battles to come. Richard stepped out into the twilight, the warmth of the cafe fading behind him, replaced by the chill of anticipation. The ocean roared, its waves crashing against the shore, a relentless rhythm that echoed the beat of his own heart. The game was on. The aroma of chorizo sizzling on the griddle was a constant companion, the rhythm of the cafe a familiar symphony. Jordan Summers, the ice queen of the beach, moved through the tables with the grace of a panther, her blonde ponytail whipping behind her like a flag of defiance. Her smile was a rare commodity, reserved for the two tiny terrors she called daughters, Isabella and Olivia. Today, however, even that smile seemed strained, a flicker of worry clouding her blue eyes. Carmelo, the cafe's portly chef with a heart as big as his paella pan, intercepted her with a knowing glance. "Something wrong, Jordan?" he rumbled, his voice thick with Cuban spices. Jordan shrugged, the gesture more a dismissal than an explanation. "Just another day in paradise," she muttered, her voice laced with a weariness that belied her years. Sabrina, the cafe's unofficial manager and resident jester, snorted from her perch behind the counter. "Paradise? More like the seventh circle of hell with screaming toddlers and bottomless coffee mugs." Jordan shot her a wry grin, the shared burden of motherhood forging a fragile bond between them. But beneath the surface, Jordan's struggle ran deeper than sleepless nights and spilled juice boxes. The rent was due tomorrow, and the meager tips weren't stretching far enough. Her ex, a charming cad with a penchant for disappearing acts, had left her holding the bag, both literally and figuratively. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, the ever-present fear of not being enough gnawing at her edges. As the lunch rush subsided, Jordan found herself drawn to the corner table where Richard Hardcase Head sat, nursing his Americano. His weathered face, etched with the lines of a life lived in the shadows, held a stoic watch over the cafe. He was a ghost from another time, a relic of a past she could only glimpse in the glint of his steely blue eyes. Their connection, unspoken and fragile, had bloomed in the quiet moments between orders, a shared understanding etched in stolen glances and fleeting smiles. Richard, with his haunted past and stoic demeanor, saw a strength in Jordan that mirrored the one he carried within. He saw the flicker of vulnerability beneath her icy exterior, the warrior fighting a battle against unseen enemies. Today, however, the shadows in his eyes seemed deeper. A tremor in his hand as he reached for his cigarette betrayed a tension she couldn't place. He looked up, catching her gaze, and a flicker of something passed between them. A silent pact forged in the shared language of unspoken anxieties. Later that afternoon, as the cafe emptied, Carmelo's kitchen stories drifted out like wisps of smoke, weaving tales of faraway lands and forgotten recipes. Jordan, leaning against the counter, listened with a half-smile, the warmth of the cafe seeping into her bones. "Life is like a paella, Jordan," Carmelo said, his voice rumbling with wisdom. "You throw in all your ingredients, the good, the bad, the spicy, the sweet. You stir it all together, let it simmer, and then, poof, magic." He winked, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes, all you need is a little heat to bring out the flavor." Jordan's smile, genuine this time, bloomed on her face. In the chaos of the cafe, she found a flicker of hope, a sense of belonging. These people, these flawed and beautiful souls, were her anchors, her reminders that she wasn't alone. As she left the cafe that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues, a new resolve settled in Jordan's heart. The struggle was still there, the fear a constant companion. But tonight, she carried a spark of something else, a flicker of defiance, a whisper of hope. The shadows might be closing in, but Jordan, the ice queen with a heart of molten lava, was ready to fight. The cafe lights blurred behind her, the familiar hum of the city replacing the comforting chatter. But as Jordan walked towards the bus stop, her head held high, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. And in the quiet moments between orders and unspilled tears, she dared to dream of a future where the heat in the kitchen wasn't just from Carmelo's paella, but from the fire within her soul. The first rays of December sunlight, tinged with the faintest blush of dawn, crept through the dusty blinds of Richard's apartment. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the echo of Jordan's laughter still reverberating in his ears, the warmth of her smile, the glint of gratitude in her blue eyes. It all felt like a mirage, a beautiful impossibility in the stark landscape of his solitary life. He was 63 and weathered by the storms of time and circumstance. Jordan, a vibrant 28-year-old woman, was a melody he hadn't realized his heart still craved. The age difference, a chasm wider than the Mississippi, gnawed at him, a whisper of doubt amidst the symphony of his burgeoning affection. His heart, long accustomed to the stoic rhythm of solitude, stuttered like a bird in a cage whenever she neared. The age difference, a chasm wider than the Mississippi, gnawed at him, a persistent whisper in the symphony of his newfound admiration. Yet, he couldn't deny the genuine concern that surged through him like a tide at the sight of her tired smile, the faint lines etched around her eyes telling tales of hardship he longed to soothe. Just then, a knock on the door jolted him from his reverie. Mac, his weathered face etched with the wisdom of countless miles, stood on the threshold, a grin splitting his beard. "Morning, sunshine," he boomed, his voice a gravelly symphony of camaraderie. "Coffee brewing?" Richard chuckled, welcoming his friend into the haven of his small apartment. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee soon filled the air, a comforting blanket against the chill of the morning. As they settled into their worn armchairs, mugs in hand, the conversation flowed like the Mississippi, meandering through stories of forgotten roads and dusty towns, tales of youthful conquests and hard-won wisdom. Mac's presence, a sturdy oak amidst the swaying reeds of Richard's emotions, offered a much-needed perspective. He saw not just the age gap. "She's a firecracker, that one," Mac chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "But there's a good heart under that tough exterior. Trust me." Richard nodded, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. He knew Mac was right. He had seen the vulnerability masked by Jordan's fierce independence, the flicker of fear behind her steely gaze. He ached to be the one to soothe those fears, to offer her a safe harbor in the storm that was her life. And then, a thought struck him, sharp and sudden. Christmas was just around the corner, a time for giving, for bridging the gap between hearts. He realized that she needed a laptop. Her studies had halted, and her wheels spinning amid her desire for a better life. The lag and stutter that mirrored the exhaustion in her eyes. That afternoon, Richard found himself sitting at his kitchen table, wrapping a laptop for a Christmas gift to her. He had thought about it. He selected a sleek, silver laptop from online, and 2 were delivered. After mentioning to Jordan that he was going to connect the 2 for storage a few weeks earlier, he had caught a fleeting look in her eyes, almost imperceptible. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a declaration of anything but a silent vow of support. He hoped she would accept it, not wanting her to feel as though there were strings attached. A gift wrapped in festive paper and tied with a scarlet ribbon, waiting by his side on the floor next to him, hoping for just the right moment to give it to her. His heart filled with joy at the thought of giving, for the first time since his wife had passed away, hoping she wouldn't feel obligated or refuse the gift. When Jordan saw the gift wrapped for her, she squealed with excitement, and the joy that Richard hadn't felt in so long filled him almost to tears as she ran off to open the gift. Sabrina came over to him and asked him, "What did you do to her, Richard? She's in the kitchen crying." When Jordan reappeared, it was apparent she had indeed been crying, not the reaction he was expecting, and, feeling insecure for a moment, asked, "Do you like it?" Jordan squealed with excitement while running back to look at the laptop some more, turned over her shoulder and said, "I love you." Richard thought to himself, "If only you knew how much I love you more." After a few more minutes, Richard got up to leave, thinking that it was best to leave it at that, leaving the tip and payment. Richard hopped onto his Harley and rode towards home. When Richard reached home, his feelings overwhelmed him. Questions ran through his mind. Did he do the right thing? Why did he feel like he just betrayed his wife's memory? Suddenly crying and not understanding why, he slumped onto the bed. He knew he did the right thing by helping her out of love. What were all these unexpected emotions about? The aroma of coffee beans and cinnamon danced in the air, a familiar balm to Richard's weathered soul. He settled into his usual corner booth, the faded red leather creaking like a comforting sigh. Sunlight from the street cast long shadows across the cafe, painting fleeting portraits on the worn wooden tables. Today, though, the warmth of the sun couldn't penetrate the chill that settled in Richard's chest. As the cafe hummed with holiday cheer, a shadow of danger crept through the door. A burly man, radiating menace like a noxious fume, approached Jordan, his voice laced with veiled threats. Richard, his past steeped in shadows, recognized the predator's glint in the stranger's eyes. He watched, silent and vigilant, a coiled spring ready to unleash. Jordan, though, met the threat head-on, her voice surprisingly steady as she refused the man's demands. A tremor of fear flickered across her face, but it was quickly masked by a steely resolve. Richard's admiration swelled, a potent mix of concern and pride. This was the fire Mac spoke of, a spark that refused to be extinguished. As the man turned to leave, his face twisting into a snarl, a deep roar reverberated from the street. Mac, astride his Harley like a chrome knight, pulled up onto the curb, his weathered face hardened with righteous fury. The stranger, cowed by the unexpected intervention, melted back into the crowd, leaving a trail of fear that lingered in the air. Later, as the cafe emptied, Richard found himself standing beside Jordan, the weight of the near miss still heavy in their shared silence. Her hand, trembling slightly, reached out and touched his arm, a wordless thank you. He covered it with his own, the warmth of their connection radiating through the cool December air. At that moment, the age difference seemed to dissipate like the steam from their coffees. All that remained was a shared vulnerability, a silent understanding that their unlikely bond held the promise of something more, something that defied both societal expectations and the whispers of his doubts. The salty tang of the Florida night air whipped against Richard's face as his Harley roared through the neon-drenched streets of St. Petersburg. The rumble of the engine and the wind in his hair were a familiar comfort, a nightly lullaby that lulled him into a sense of solitude. But tonight, the hum of the engine was drowned out by a rising drumbeat of unease in his chest. He'd seen it all, the shadows that danced at the edges of his vision, the whispers of danger that snaked through the city's underbelly. But nothing could have prepared him for the sight that unfolded before his eyes as he rounded a corner onto a deserted alley. There, under the harsh glare of a street lamp, Jordan, his unlikely muse, was being dragged towards a van by two hulking figures. Their faces, obscured by darkness and motorcycle helmets, held a chilling menace. Jordan, her blonde hair a stark contrast against the grimy brick wall, fought back with an admirable ferocity, but the two men were simply too strong. Panic surged through Richard, a primal roar erupting from his gut. He didn't hesitate. Adrenaline coursed through his veins, igniting a dormant fire within him. He gunned the engine, the roar of the Harley tearing through the night as he launched himself into the fray. One of the figures, startled by the sudden noise, turned just in time to see a chrome blur hurtling toward him. Richard's fist, a hardened instrument forged in years of service, connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. The attacker crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The other figure, a hulking brute with a skull tattooed on his shaved head, spun around, his eyes widening in surprise. He lunged at Richard, but the old soldier was ready. Years of training, honed in the crucible of war and black ops, kicked in. He danced around the man's clumsy blows, his strike swift and precise, finding its mark on the attacker's temple. The brute crumpled like a felled tree. Jordan, still shaken but unharmed, stared at Richard, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Richard," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out, his weathered hand gently cupping her face. "Don't worry, Jordan," he said, his voice gruff but reassuring. "I'm here." Suddenly, a hit from behind knocked Richard to the ground, a searing pain in his head, and everything went black. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the air, a siren song of hope in the symphony of fear. A sheriff's cruiser, its lights flashing like angry eyes, skidded to a halt. A tall, imposing figure emerged, his gaze sweeping over the scene with a practiced eye. "Sheriff Johnson," Richard said, stepping forward. "I just witnessed a kidnapping." The sheriff's face hardened. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. As Richard recounted the events, a sense of dread settled over him. He knew this wasn't some random incident. This was something bigger, something darker. The mention of the skull tattoo sent a shiver down his spine. It was the emblem of the Arachnids, a ruthless biker gang rumored to be working for the city's notorious kingpin, Michel Mazzella. At that moment, under the watchful gaze of the sheriff's deputies, a new chapter began. The cafe, once a haven of coffee and conversation, became a battleground, a place where the lines between good and evil were blurred. Richard, the weather plus E plus D warrior, found himself thrust into a role he never sought. Protector, guardian, a knight in shining leather against the encroaching darkness. The night had revealed a truth colder than the Florida wind. The shadows were closer than he thought, and the fight for justice had just begun. Back at the cafe, the regulars, oblivious to the storm brewing outside, went about their routines. Sabrina, her sharp wit masking a growing concern, exchanged sarcastic banter with Mac, the biker with a heart of gold. Carmelo, his gentle smile belying the worry in his eyes, prepared his signature dish, the aroma of spices mingling with the scent of freshly brewed coffee. But the air, once thick with the familiar comfort of routine, now crackled with a newfound tension. The knowledge of the darkness lurking just beyond the cafe's threshold cast a long shadow, a reminder that their haven was not as secure as they once believed. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, Richard, his Harley parked outside the cafe, watched the city awaken. He knew that the sun would rise again, but the night had irrevocably changed him. The morning sun pierced through the Venetian blinds, casting long stripes across the cluttered desk of Sheriff Brody Johnson. Sleepless night gnawed at the corners of his eyes, mirroring the unease gnawing at his gut. Jordan Summers, the cafe waitress, and Richard Head, the enigmatic cafe regular, were in the grip of the Arachnids, a notorious biker gang rumored to be the muscle for Michel Mazzella, the city's kingpin. The clock ticked relentlessly, mocking his every pause. The paperwork piled on his desk mocked him even more. Regulations, protocols, chains of command, all grinding with glacial speed against the fiery urgency that boiled within him. Each phone call, each request for additional resources, felt like an eternity wasted. He slammed his fist onto the desk, the impact jarring his deputies stationed outside. "Sir?" Deputy Sanchez peeked in, his weathered face etched with concern. "Any news?" Brody shook his head, the frustration heavy in his throat. "Bureaucracy's got its feet firmly planted in molasses," he growled. "Jordan could be anywhere. By the time we get the green light, the Arachnids could be 1,000 miles away." "We can't wait, Sheriff," a gruff voice interjected. Mac, the biker with a heart of gold, stood at the doorway, his face grim. "Time's our enemy here. We gotta work outside the lines." Brody's gaze held a flicker of hope. Mac, with his network of biker contacts and street smarts, could be the wild card they needed. But was he risking a civilian putting lives on the line in a desperate gamble? He glanced at his deputies, their faces mirroring his internal struggle. Loyalty and duty warred with reason, the air thick with unspoken understanding. These were good men, sworn to uphold the law, but Jordan was one of their own, just as much as any badge-wearing officer. "All right," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "But we do this smart. Mac, you gather your intel. Find out where they might be holding Jordan. We'll follow the protocol, every step of the way. But we'll be ready to move when the official wheels take too long to turn." A wave of relief washed over the room. Deputy Sanchez offered a grateful nod, while Mac's lips stretched into a determined smile. He knew the risks and the potential consequences. But for Jordan, for all they stood for, it was a leap of faith they were all willing to take. Meanwhile, Richard paced like a caged panther in the confines of his apartment. Jordan's abduction gnawed at his soul, stirring the ghosts of forgotten battles and a dormant sense of duty. He couldn't sit still, waiting for the authorities to move at their glacial pace. He had to act, and he wouldn't be alone. His phone buzzed, the familiar code name igniting a spark in his eyes. His old comrades, ghosts from the shadows, were ready. Their loyalty, forged in the crucible of black ops, wouldn't waver. A team of elite shadows, honed for covert operations, would stand beside him, a silent phalanx against the darkness. The cafe, once a haven of coffee and conversation, became a staging ground. Carmelo, the chef with a heart as warm as his oven, offered a safe house. his loyalty to Richard undying. Sabrina, the ever-sarcastic queen of the front of house, served as their eyes and ears, her wisecracks masking a silent fear and unwavering support. The clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against their resolve. Richard knew the chances were slim, the risks were monumental. But for Jordan, for the fragile hope of justice, they were ready to walk into the shadows, to become hunters in their own right. The chase was on, and the sheriff's dilemma became a fight against time, a desperate gamble for freedom, in the heart of a city shrouded in secrets. The lines between law and justice, between heroes and outlaws, were about to blur in the crucible of this night. The battle for Jordan and the soul of the city had just begun. Moonlight painted jagged shadows across the deserted street. Inside Carmelo's cozy kitchen, a low hum of activity vibrated against the ticking of the grandfather clock. Richard, eyes narrowed in concentration, traced the labyrinthine paths on a tattered map of the city. Around him, a motley crew of unlikely allies had assembled, each casting their distinct silhouette against the warm glow of the overhead lights. Mac, the grizzled biker, sat at the table, his calloused thumb skimming over the worn leather of his motorcycle jacket. His face, etched with the wisdom of countless miles and close calls, reflected the gravity of the situation. "The Arachnids Clubhouse," he rasped, his voice low and gravelly. "Southside, near the old docks. Tight security, razor wire, and shadows thick enough to swallow a man whole." Sabrina, the cafe's sassy queen, perched on the countertop, her lips pursed in a contemplative frown. Her sharp hazel eyes flickered between the map and Richard, her usually sarcastic wit replaced by a steely resolve. "Cameras? Patrolling guards? Any intel on Siren's seductive siren song?" Richard, the steely glint in his eyes mirroring the moonlight outside, nodded grimly. "Ghost, our silent observer, reported cameras on the perimeter, but blind spots around the back. Viper, the muscle, leads the night patrols, but Shadow Wraith might be our ticket in. She's a ghost in the shadows, just like her name." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the clock. Each face held a flicker of fear, a sliver of doubt, but underneath it all, a fierce determination burned. They were a ragtag band of misfits, thrown together by circumstance and a shared desire for justice. There was Richard, the ex-Black Ops soldier, his past woven into the fabric of his present. Mac, the biker with a heart of gold, his loyalty a testament to the bonds forged on the open road. Sabrina, the sarcastic shield hiding a warrior's spirit, her wit a weapon honed in the crucible of cafe life. And Carmelo, the chef with a heart bigger than his kitchen, his warmth a beacon of hope in the darkness. Their adversary, Michel Mazzella, was a viper in the shadows, his criminal empire a tangled web that stretched across the city. The Arachnids, his loyal enforcers, were a pack of wolves, their fangs bared, their eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. But tonight, this unlikely band of wolves would hunt their own. Mazzella has a vendetta against Richard for a not-so-distant situation has taken. Jordan, now a target for his retribution. A knock at the back door startled them. Richard, hand instinctively reaching for the hidden blade beneath his coat, cautiously approached. The door creaked open, revealing a cloaked figure, shrouded in shadows. It was Ghost, his face hidden behind a black mask, his silence speaking volumes. He handed Richard a small, leather-bound journal. "Mazzella's ledger," he whispered, his voice a raspy echo. "Names, locations, schedules, everything you need to crack his nest." This is the end of part 1 of our story. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel.